Culture. İsmail Hakkı Tonguç says education at village institutes is all about learning, learning by doing, by practice. This is quite important. And the theoretical information, knowledge was transformed and put into practical work. And İsmail Hakkı Tonguç also says, for education, it is not right to take children out of the community, of the society, of real life. On the contrary, we need to put them at the center of real life, of social community life. Professor Kocabaş, maybe we can have a pause now for the first round and give the floor to Firdevs Gümüşoğlu, who will be speaking about İsmail Hakkı Tonguç and his time, and we will have a second round. Of course, I'll leave the floor to Firdevs.
Firdevs
Firdevs hocam ses.
Affedersiniz. Öncelikle
First of all, I would like to thank Miss Songül and Mr. Kemal for giving me the floor. I will continue from where Mr. Kemal left off. I'll try to share with you my own work. Actually, I'll be talking about the education philosophy of İsmail Hakkı Tonguç. As we all know, Tonguç is a very important figure in the education, culture, and history of our country. But he couldn't get what he deserved because until recently, those working in the field of education philosophy have ignored his thoughts. In terms of the education problems of the day, we need to give the value that he deserves, as specified by Mr. Kemal and Mrs. Songül. The thoughts of Tonguç are based on an education theory that is creative. He has developed this theory himself and also applied it. During my speech, I'll be talking about the works of Tonguç and how he shed light on today. Tonguç became the Director General of Primary Education. He wrote lots of letters to village teachers, village principals, and district governors, as well as students and graduates. The analysis of these letters is really important in terms of education philosophy, because in the end of 1930s, he wrote some letters, and when you look at these letters, he actually created some copies through his typewriter, and he created an archive out of these letters, so he was aware of these letters, and it is quite important. Tonguç created a memory out of visuals. Today, we are using lots of visuals on TV, and Tonguç created the main theme for those. Starting from the second half of 1930s, he wrote letters to students, principals of village institutes, and he wanted a copy of the photos they had. This is a very important issue in terms of creating an archive. On the other hand, while looking at the works of Tonguç, we see a very bright and colorful scientists. Before delving into that, Ceyhun Atıf Kansu had an evaluation of the works of Tonguç, and he says that he is leading the villagers through the revolution of Turkish education, and he is following the spirit of a people that are distributed in the nature. And this spirit was shown in the War of Salvation, and Tonguç has seen the depth of this spirit, and he thinks that we have to depend on these people. In 1927, he started preparing his works, and until his death, he actually authored 15 books and many more articles. In 1938, he focused on the training of teachers and vocational training. He also focuses on the spirit of being a teacher, and he also focuses on handicrafts through his books. Other than that, he also translated some works into Turkish, and he wrote important things in the forewords of those translations. So through enlightenment, he tried to analyze the German education system. When you look at those translations, these are quite important for today. And there is a village of children that he referred to in these books. I will mainly focus on two books. First of all, he wrote important books on occupational and vocational education and training, and he also focuses on the qualities of vocational education. And throughout the pandemic, we have seen how important the vocational education is. So his definition of vocational education is really important. So there's a philosophy behind this vocational education. So job is like creating a work of art. So a person who is beaten by the job loses his or her self-confidence. So the trainers in institutes must guide students in the first place. And a job that results in achievement is a work of art. On the other hand, Tonguç argues that there is a relation between a thought and work. And this is not only the right of intellectuals, but this is also an entitlement for poor students in villages. And in that respect, this is also important, and it empowers individuals. So it is in the middle of 1930s. This is what Tonguç says. Young people must be equipped with practical knowledge rather than theoretical knowledge. We see the reflection of these in his letters and books. Similarly, at the end of 1960s, there's a critical pedagogical thought. Creer wrote those things at the end of 1960s, but we see these thoughts in Tonguç at an earlier time. Freire refers to the corporate systematics of banking at the end of 1960s, But Tonguç refers to the same issues at an earlier time. So he says that classical training should be given up, and he acts as the leader of critical thinking in education. When we look at the works of Tonguç, especially in terms of training or education in villages, he has authors a book in 1938. This is a great contribution in certain aspects. So he has a methodology of a sociologist. So this book is planned as a monography of education and training in villages. And he makes some plans for training and education in the future. So this activity or study is used as a reference for the planning of education curricula. And we see that he has used more than 80 foreign sources in that book, and he actually sends a survey to more than 100 people, and his addressees are people from Kars, Ankara, Rize, Kırklareli, and when we look at the main issues within this survey, he is focusing on the structural analysis of villages. So he's trying to analyze villagers in terms of intellectual life, and he's also looking at the village in terms of daily lifestyle. He's looking at the sadness and happiness of villagers, and these may vary depending on the region in the country. So, how does the village cope up with the sadness, and how do they react to happiness? In that book, he looks at the qualities of education and training in villages. As in conventional training, he's actually working with a focus on the society. And in that book, he also analyzes village institutes, and he looks at a person from the perspective of an educator, a trainer, and he also looks at the cognitive qualities of teachers, and this is also an important contribution in this sense. And there are types of villages in that book. So we need to organize our training based on the realities of villages. So he's also creating a scale of analyzing villages within the survey. So how do villagers behave against or with regard to their children? This is also important in terms of giving some hints. What is their perception on the children that are getting sick or ill? So this is quite important. There is a social disease in that period, and he is trying to analyze that social disease. That's why you have to focus on the behaviors in a village to structure your training system. In that sense, Tonguç says that these qualities are important milestones and pillars of education system. So as long as you do not learn anything from villagers, you cannot teach anything to them. So there must be a teacher learning something rather than knowing everything. So there's another point that he refers to. We shouldn't only focus on theoretical teachings, as we, but also on the critical thinking of villagers. So he creates a bridge between theories and daily life in the village, because he very well knows that ideas must be turned into actions. Otherwise, villagers will not have any trust in you. He will focus on the ideas that are converted into actions. And for centuries, they have coped up with many problems through this thinking style. Actually, intellectuals consider villagers as weak or as people who have id fixes, but they show resistance against lots of problems in their daily lives. The main aim of Tonguç is to create generations whose destiny is based on the society. So we shouldn't stay away from the society. We should focus on the destiny of the nation to create our education system. And this is strengthened in village institutes. So 81 years ago, village institutes were established, they were closed down, and we are still talking about those institutes. The most important critical points for village institutes is that schools should adapt itself to life. This is also very meaningful. Today, we are focusing on education system that is based on knowing everything by heart and without developing anything. But we have to transform these schools into some living institutions. Education can empower a person and render these persons also weak. So idealism should lie at the heart of education system. I would also like to emphasize another point in his works. His thoughts his thoughts with regard to the philosophy of education refer to a village that needs to be immigrated. Actually, this book is really important in the sense that it provides a theoretical framework as well as a practical framework in the form of village institutes and villages. It was written in 1939 and revised in 1947. When we look at its reflections on today, when we look at the education problems of Turkey today, we can analyze them and understand them through the chapters in this book. He visits 61 provinces and analyzes more than 100,000 villages in Turkey to analyze the education system and to see how to invigorate the education system in villages. And he says that we should understand the villages very well. When we look at the problems in our current system, we should focus on the social system of Turkey so that we need to program and plan the curriculum of Turkey as specified by Mr. Kemal and Mrs. Songül. There is an issue of villages for Tonguç, and it's a case for Tonguç. But this is not a development policy planned on the table. So they need to create a policy to diagnose the problem and in that way develop villages. Therefore, we need to stay away from the system where villagers are turned into serfs. So we have limited time, so I'm just highlighting on some issues, and I would like to refer to another book, The Concept of Primary Education. The title of the book is this, and this is a very important book with regard to the relation between individuals and citizenship. So a democratic state is based on primary education in modern sense of the world. So We need to strengthen the relation of individuals with citizenship. In that sense, he is also talking about the tools of transformation. So primary education is like planting some seeds on the soil, and there must be an approach for the analysis of education systems within this book. In 1949, he wrote a book called The Encyclopedia of Teachers. So there are some co-authors in this book. So there is an article called, or chapter called, Outdoor Education. Students are getting tired within closed doors and classrooms. That's why outdoor education must be prioritized, and education must be actually planned in outside environments. So we need to be away from boring environments. This is a very important contribution of this book. Tonguç also has another book with regard to letters to village institutes, and we see his philosophy on education. It was written in the end of 1930s, and there's a bureaucratic structure transferred from the Ottoman Empire. So he chooses to write letters to be away from this bureaucratic state. So we need to bridge the gap between the managed and managers. So we need to focus on a dialogue-based education system. Freire, I would like to refer to Freire in the pedagogy of oppressed. There is a silent culture where the oppressed are embedded into. Through village institutes, the culture of silence is eliminated, and people are empowered to have their say. This is a very important method through the letters. So his style in his letters is really important because it's an educational method. It's a supportive method. It is based on cooperation. It improves self-confidence and respect, and it encourages the love for nature and people. I think this is very important and valuable for educators and trainers. So a dialogue-based training forms the basis for life, because if there is no equality, dialogue is not transformative. Dialogue must have a function for transformation. Therefore, the system of village institutes is prioritizing dialogue in an environment that is not equal or equitable. So the communication was very difficult in that time, and what was written by Tonguç was really important, and those actions were transformative for education as specified by Freire. Dialogue is an enabling tool which acts through words, and words are only important through praxis. There is no real world without practice. We see the traces of that in Tonguç's acts. So we see the acts and actions in what is done by people. So it emphasizes on the change of the system. So of course we make use of cooperation, entertainment, excitement. He actually infers that knowledge from the villagers of Anatolia. So he addresses the principles of villagers and he addresses them as dear brother or sister. And he also addresses the students as my dear son or daughter. This is very valuable, I think. There is a director general in Ankara, and he is not only sitting in front of his table and he values people and he is like a father in the eyes of students. So he says that we need to mobilize villages that are stagnant. So we need to be sincere in our actions and sayings. That's why we need an approach based on human beings. So we need to improve production and we need to add a technique to it. Therefore, we need to mobilize villagers, and in line with this aim, we have great achievements out of the village institute system. So he's against bureaucracy and he states that in his letters we can actually organize instructions from the bottom to the top. So we need to empower individuals to know and learn things. So it is a process where individuals take part. So we know that from our interviews with the graduates of village institutes, a person learns how to ride a bike and then this person teaches lots of people how to ride a bike. So Tonguç also says that we need to stay away from what is ordinary. We need to act in line with the views of villagers. We need to know them and we need to actually act in cooperation with them. You have only 5 minutes. Please sum up. I'll sum up right now. He also thinks that or argues that students shouldn't know by heart what is instructed by students. This is specified and argued in the beginning of 1940s, and we see the examples of these in his letters addressed to the principals of village institutes. And there's another point within the framework of democracy. The curricula cannot be dictated by the headquarters. Therefore, you will instill the spirit through your village institutes. You should make use of the spirit at the maximum level. Therefore, Tonguç aims to create exemplary lives in terms of management and theory. He also says that do everything very simple. There should be colorful appearance of students. There must be some tables with gardens. He also refers to aesthetic vision. I actually examined one of the village institutes in detail. Kazım Altun, the graduate of the village institute, writes a letter to Tonguç and he addresses him as the father. So under the conditions where the World War II was prevailing, this graduate says that the humanity is on the verge of the war that is very bad for human beings. So we are some good and lucky students actually studied in village institutes. So there is no differentiation between the managed and managers. So horizontal relations are established through that. On previous Monday, I also attended another meeting with Mr. Kemal. I would like to say the same thing. There is a confession by Şerif Tekmen, a teacher in the Village Institute. He says that he acts as teachers in villages for 8 years. For 8 years, I acted as village teacher, but other colleagues moved to the cities. So there's no bread, bed, nothing in the village. I don't have the knowledge to provide that. So we are facing with the villagers. It is not possible to rationalize my ideas with them. And after education of 11 years, actually, I'm the poorest person in the world. And thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you.
Yani inanın saatlerce
Thank you,
dinledik.
Firdevs. We can spend hours listening to you. And you are a sociologist and educator who is spending a lot of time on the matter. Both Kemal and Firdevs and soon Haluk have produced a lot of work on the matter. And we see that the more we study village institutes, the more we can see that the memory of the society is embedded in that. In the Turkish education system, the neoliberal period, the Bologna process, the student-centered approach is already does already have its roots in our history of education. So the Bologna process and there are some neoliberal impositions on us, but when we look at beyond them actually, we can see that we can rely on the unique nature of our own education system and education history. So there is a debate about being national and being local, but İsmail Hakkı Tonguç and Hasan Ali Yücel, who was a philosopher, actually did their own work. And in their work, the history of and the model of the basis of village institutes were very influential in the construction of contemporary citizens. So our modernization is different from Western modernization. Western modernization is actually based on the urban structure and capitalism. Yet our modernization, the village institutes model, is a unique model that has its roots in our soil. And therefore, please specifically pay attention to Hasan Ali Yücel's speeches in parliament, especially the political science professionals. Hasan Ali Yücel says, we call these institutes, not schools, because institute means a place that provides universal education, like university. So this is how institutes were conceptualized. In 1940, Hasan Ali Yücel talked about this in the parliament and says they specifically call these institutes because you cannot limit education to schools. As Firdevs said, industrial pedagogy was quite new, but in our own history with Hasan Ali Yücel and İsmail Hakkı Tonguç, when we reread their work, we can discover their treasure. And when we read İsmail Hakkı Tonguç's work, I always remember Habermas, Jürgen Habermas. He talks about communicative action. In 1960s, 70s, there were some issues and problems, and the solution of that, as the neo-right, rightist fractions call it, it's not the way it should be solved. So it's not about voting and changing the political power, as they put it, but it's about participative, pluralist democracy. And this was a model. Village institutes were a model to build that. It's a revolution of culture. It's not only about education. It is about the rule of the people, about democracy. It is based on secularism, and it's about secularization. So Habermas' work is important, but we have to go back and read Tonguç's work. In liberal philosophy, there is this educational philosophy, educational pedagogy that limits itself, but we have to reread, as I said, İsmail Hakkı Tonguç's work in sociology or social policy courses. I always say, if you want to learn about the meaning of development, it's not about looking at the Western systems, but rather we have to go down to village, to rural development, and we have to discover the meaning of rural development, and we have to look into the meaning of it. If we want to revisit the meaning of it, then we have to go back to İsmail Hakkı Tonguç's work. And Firdevs, as you said, Tonguç's work is a monography, but it is a work of anthropology, a very important work of anthropology. From the sense of ownership in the village, you know, they built a model, a unique model. And until the law in 1984, public administration law, because it was when the number of villages were down to 35,000, and in 2000s down to 14,000. But agricultural production, social development, the neoliberal process of capitalism were actually targeted back then. And those criticizing village institutes do not know about the history, full history of village institutes. So we have to look into the history of village institutes from a different perspective, rather than the theoretical aspect, which Kemal talked about. It is about the practical aspects. And in our modern education system, there is a conflict between theory and practice. So Tonguç's work and quotes from 1940s is actually applicable to, still applicable to today. And we haven't been able to train teachers and educators, and we haven't been able to rediscover curriculum. So we have to go back and look at those days. So Tonguç, in all his work before the village institutes, talks about this. And when we read Hasan Ali Yücel's work, the information about village institutes, both in the parliament and later on, were actually indicative of how unique the village institutes model was, and we had to revisit social development. So we have a model in front of our eyes. Actually, if we know our model better, then that would be much better. I mean, so I'm sure Kemal will talk about this in the second round. I think there's a question to me. Sure. Very briefly, in one sentence, I'll talk about this. Of course, this is a broad perspective. Ayça Sesigür asked a question. This system, you know, it's not about rural societies and urban societies. The question is about whether this can be implemented, still implemented in rural areas. This is what I understand. As Tonguç stated in and did in late 30s, we have to do what he did back then, analyze cities and urban spaces. As Songül stated, villages are now turned into neighborhoods. So there are a very limited number of villages. So the pandemic taught us a great deal. And based on that, we have to conduct regional analysis, including both villages and cities. And we have to create a production-based education system. Even if you work in the IT sector, there must be a link with education. So you have to feed yourself, and our food security is jeopardized, and access to food is a problematic area in many parts of the world, and therefore, based on the means that were provided by village institutes, we can, I'm sure, consider and analyze a new model, and we can now have access to any part in the world. So any place in the world. So we have to rerun our analysis, and we need to launch a production-based education system. No matter whether we want this or not, this is what life imposed on us today. So the solution is in the village institute system and philosophy. This is what I think. And in terms of local curriculum, I don't mean a local curriculum. It's not about creating new curriculum locally. This is something else. I am in favor of a unitary state, and I don't want to cause a misunderstanding, but it is, what I mean is about analyzing, running local analysis. In 21 regions, village institutes were established, and maybe we can divide the country into 5 regions, and 5 regions could be handled differently in terms of enlightenment and development on a scientific basis, of course. And this is what I think we need to do. Thank you very much for your interest. I have to leave shortly for another meeting. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Firdevs hocama çok teşekkür
We'd
ediyorum.
like to thank Firdevs. I think there was another question to Firdevs. Oh, let me check. I didn't see that. Asking for your opinion. Necdet Aykaç asked the question. Under Ayça's question, could you please check that?
Yok sayıldığı dönemde sanatın bu kadar köy enstitülerinde önem verilmesi konusunda
So, art is neglected today, and yet village institutes paid a great deal of attention to arts. Yes, you're right. Both arts and handicrafts are basic notions that we have to dwell on because they are part of what makes a human being a human being. And today we have to pay a great deal of attention to art, to the development of art and handicrafts, art and crafts, and planning education, reinvigorating education, and its links with social development. I think they are all interrelated. It's something to discuss. Definitely, there are many things and points to discuss, but the model of the village institutes will be a model for us. For instance, Beşikdüzü. Tonguç says the Black Sea region was an agricultural field for Beşikdüzü Village Institute. So just consider that. As long as we as educators and education planners and politicians see the tips and clues and hints here, then everything will be much better. Without political polarization, I believe we can work together to save the education system in the country, and we are ready as scientists to do what we can. Thank you very much, Firdevs, for your contribution. Thank you very much indeed. Because village institutes, the components, an important component of village institutes is art. So without philosophy, we cannot initiate thinking and questioning, and without arts, we cannot find ways of expressing ourselves and our opinions and our ideas. So the project of the village institutes to educate intellectuals was a main pillar, and it had a focus on human beings and individuals. And the focus on individuals was about rendering people the sovereign of the country, and those that were excluded in the historical process were actually going to be rendered the sovereigns. And when we read about Rimshi, I mean, there are class and categorization of the intellectuals, yet in the Turkish modernization, the most ordinary individuals and intellectuals could transform the society, but they would have to learn questioning, and they would have to raise an awareness on that. Thank you very much, Firdevs. Now, I would like to give the floor to a philosopher. Thank you very much, by the way. I'll have to leave now. Thank you. Haluk, my dear friend, my dear colleague, a very distinguished philosopher and educator of our country. I'd like to give the floor to you. Thank you. It's always a risk to be the last person to speak, because the speakers before you say most of the things that have to be said. So I don't want to repeat their statements. But first, I'd like to offer my thanks. So in an institutional congress, having a session about village institutes is precious, and the congress, the symposium, has an organization team that has been working for so long. Department of Philosophy of Muğla University and the rector's office of the University Hüseyin Gazi Tokdemir, Yahya Altınkurt, Sabahattin Çelikbaş, the dean from the Muğla University, İlker, and a whole team actually supported the organization of the symposium. I would like to offer my thanks to them. And this session is being interpreted into English. It is not easy, and I would like to thank the interpreters for their hard work, because we have attendees from Turkey and from abroad, and I would like to offer my regards to all attendees as well. Indeed, I would like to base my speech on a couple of points. I'm not very pessimistic. This is the day of village institutes, and there are good news. Mayor of Ankara Metropolitan Municipality said the Hasanoğlan Village Institute campus will be rehabilitated, and there are many buildings of the village institutes there. So this is great news. And there will be some repair and renovation work. And if this work is completed, that will be really, really meaningful on this very specific day. İlhan Başgöz, Professor İlhan Başgöz, I would like to remember him. I worked with him for years, and he loved village institutes. And İlhan Başgöz has a book called Atatürk and the Cul-de-sac of Education in Turkey. And İlhan Başgöz was the representative of a significant generation. So I would like to remember him at this very occasion. So why do we have to think about village institutes? The philosophical accumulation and knowledge of 3,000 years, in terms of the perspective that is brought along with that, I would like to speak of my own ideas. As you know, there are many concepts in philosophy. There are many different discussions, multilateral discussions, and there are intrinsic and extrinsic views. And these all underline the importance of philosophy. For 81 years, the importance of village institutes have been debated and discussed, and this will continue. But there are some false and inaccurate approaches to village institute. There are many people who assign a meaning to village institute thinking that it represents a political idea. This is a hegemonic approach, and the village institute served a political purpose, the conveying of a political idea. There was, and there has always been, such a criticism. Shortly before, Songül talked about Habermas's communicative action principle, and rationality is quite important in that sense. The concept of rationality can be discussed, but what Habermas talks about by content is about rendering a topic debatable. If it can be debated, then it is rational, Habermas says. So it is also, therefore, it is very important to address all aspects of village institutes while discussing about village institutes. Just limiting it to political views is a great limitation. 2,500 years ago, Socrates talks about the importance of things. Without knowing what something is, you cannot solve it. So if you don't know about the reason of something, without knowing it, you cannot relate to that. Therefore, all relations are interconnected in some sense. Therefore, the question, what are village institutes, should be internally and externally answered. And there is a multi-layered answer to that. It's not about only a moment of social development. It's not only a synthesis of a historical process. It is beyond that. And that is only it is only possible to discover this with an internal approach. And the previous speakers also talked about that. There is this external facade of village institutes that we read about, we know about the practices there. And behind village institutes, there is another aspect that feeds on ideas and philosophy. And this information is hidden in İsmail Hakkı Tonguç's work. And without reading all these work, just focusing on certain aspects of village institutes would be an external approach and view of the village institutes. So, looking externally, the literature doesn't represent our own literature. So, the literature should be based on what Hasan Ali Yücel and İsmail Hakkı Tonguç wrote. So, if we ask Socrates' question and ask what is a village institute, I believe there is a universal aspect of this. Village institutes is a universal meeting. Transformation of human beings, art, philosophy, the willingness and curiosity of people to transform nature, employment, vocations, professions, production, everything is involved. And we know this from the important milestones in the history of philosophy. So this universality or universalism is something that has multi-dimensions. And there are original references here. So, this fact cannot be read only from certain aspects. It was definitely an educational movement, and village institutes actually were established at an important period of educational history. But we have to answer the question, universally, where were village institutes located? So, I believe we have to look beyond the Turkish educational history to answer that question, and we have to include certain concepts and philosophy in it to make sure village institutes get the deserved attention and analysis. So, on an internal context, yes, village institutes serve to the independence of this country, and Hasan Ali Yücel says we didn't inherit from anyone, and and İsmail Hakkı Tonguç also says this was a unique model. Therefore, based on the philosophical knowledge, I think we have to adopt another perspective on village institutes, and Firdevs also talked about this briefly. Just a couple of points I'd like to raise to run this analysis. Telling the truth is important. It is not easy to tell the facts, to tell the truth. Let me elaborate on that. You know Diogenes of Sinope. They ask him, what is the most important thing in the world? He says, doing prasia. What is that? It means the courage to tell things as they are, truthfully. So, and this is already integrated into European values in terms of democracy and human rights. So, telling things as they are, which can even be called freedom of thought. This is what Diogenes said. So, human beings, individuals, must have the ability to tell about their ideas, about as they are. And Michel Foucault also talks about this. Of course, Foucault talks about the courage to tell the truth and says this is based in Europe, but I criticize that because it's not only limited to that. Because in his work, he says, and in his work, he excavates information, as he says. He goes down to the bottom of knowledge, and this requires a great know-how. So you have to analyze 3,000 years, and that's what Foucault does. He says, I saw this concept for the first time in Euripides' work, the courage to tell the truth. I criticize that point because Euripides was an Athenian, and he set the starting point for being a European individual. So it is not possible to strip Europeans from their right to have the courage to tell the truth. But this goes way back beyond that. It goes from Urla to Athens. The professor of Euripides actually talks about Phrasia, and then we have to speak about Anatolia. So from a European focus, then we shift the focus to Anatolia. This is an important political center, and philosophy and the courage to tell the truth actually originated from Europe. Think about Hegel. Hegel says this thought cannot be thought to originate from the East. It is unbelievable. According to him, there is no philosophy in the East. And they are just based in history, they say, because the East doesn't have conscience, and Anatolia is included in the East in their opinion. And there is this legend and myth that started in Çanakkale and continued with village institutes. It was all about being able to tell the truth as they were. So this concept of Prezi actually had the courage to tell the truth, had a very important place in village institutes. Many artists, many poets actually came about and, from the village institutes, and they read the world classics, and the translation of the classics was quite important. That enabled the transformation, the internal transformation of the students at village institutes. And I can say that this is deep-rooted in village institutes. So there are, these are already embedded in the campuses of village institutes, but we have to adopt an internal view, not an external one. Tonguç says this is a work of reinvigoration, and this is done through education, looking at the concepts, the society, the individuals. It's not only about them. There is an anthropological focus here of getting free. And this is what makes the village institutes unique. The philosophical anthropology, without understanding it, it's not possible to understand the transformation at village institutes. Firdevs talked about Freire, and the change that is mentioned there is not internal, but at village institute, the students are internally transformed and changed. Hand, mind, and heart. If everyone has them, then they have to bring them together, bring the three together to produce, to work, to write, to engage in agriculture, to change this into conscious. If we look at Hegel's words, his work about nature and about consciousness has a background, and the human mind tries to find a way to relate with nature, to find their own conscience. And that is why anything human beings can do could be done at village institutes. Taking steps from inside to outside is not only about courage, it was definitely a work of courage, but also facilitated an inside to outside transformation. And therefore, Liechtensteiner, John Dewey, and the others that were relevant in this context. But in terms of Tonguç's work and ideas about village institutes, the work of the others is not as integrated as they could be. And I know the list of books in the library of Hasan Ali Yücel as well. I used to visit his house and look at his books in his library. And the Western classics and the Eastern classics were there in his library, sitting together on the shelves. So village institutes was an amalgamation in that sense. The East and the West can be easily separated into two geographies and polarized and, could be rendered disadvantageous. But still, village institutes talked about and focused on union, and Mozart and Aşık Veysel were played at the same time, and Plato's dialogues were also studied. And Vidya Karja, a philosopher, also said at Arifiye, they visited the village institute, and Bediye saw that they were reading Plato's work. And Bediye said, if I can work as a teacher here, then that means I'm a real teacher. So that is all there. And we have to adopt a holistic approach. Production comes later, development comes later, because if you do not internally transform, you cannot develop. If your hand is cut, you cannot raise your hand. So there is a truth that touches people. And therefore, the concept of society is sometimes meaningless to me. What is society? A group of individuals. But the transformation of human beings, the individuals reading books, and the actions of people, and the art of individuals are all related, and the truth of village institutes can only be seen from that perspective. So this holistic approach, philosophy, sociology, anthropology, they should be viewed holistically. Political science, sociology can have an external approach on that. So the main issue is about a political perspective on village institutes. Of course, there was a political transformation, idea of the political transformation involved, but it was all about transforming from an empire into a republic. It's about the notion and awareness of being a citizen. Because if you become a citizen, you start to do something for your nation, but it all boils down to touching people. And some hints were shared, and the students at village institutes were given love and affection and were instructed. This was about equal opportunities and social justice. These are concepts that we are still discussing today and we cannot provide. And therefore, during this pandemic, when we consider access to technology, for instance, there is some injustice. So allow me to repeat briefly. We have to separate it from other schools. It was mentioned before, but the philosophical accumulation brings along some theories in education. I don't want to elaborate too much on that. These are called educational philosophies. There are various educational philosophies. You know, Plato, Aristoteles, and Kant and others contributed to this, and John Dewey could also be included. But in terms of the philosophical basis of village institutes, there were some differences. For instance, just a small example, and this is always debated. And, you know, talking about movements or some currents in education, I don't think it should be limited to that. You know, in perennialism, there is no subject, and, you know, there's a different approach. And it defends the reading of world classics, but it was natural in village institutes. It was a means of transformation. Another thing is that curriculum was hidden in the student, was embedded in the student at village institutes. It's not about the curriculum that was instructed or imposed. It was taught that the curriculum was inside the student, already embedded, and it was only about revealing that curriculum. And that was what İsmail Hakkı Tonguç and the managers of village institutes and the trainers tried to do, as Kemal mentioned. The trainers courses experience was quite significant, but such ready-made approaches and modern curriculum, they were not the case in village institutes, and that provided an independence. Saturday meetings, Saturday critics, and art meetings, and children's theater and discussions about what they read. And the village institute had, each village institute had a library with world classics, including Western classics. And today, even today, students are having difficulty in reading Western classics, and even students of philosophy have difficulty in that. So I'm about to wrap up.
We have 5 minutes because I'll give the floor to Mr. Kemal. Will you give me the word again? Yes. We have no problem with regard to time limitation. So I will also give the floor to you. So then let's give the floor to Mr. Kemal. As a philosopher, Mr. Haluk talked about the importance of the subject in order to enable us to understand the issue. So when we talk about the cultural revolution of village institutes, it is very elemental for creating a bridge, and the symbol of teacher is really influential for development in the village. In terms of sociological aspects, this is also important. This person cannot lead to these development without creating this system. So we have to understand village institutes as a sociologist. So I don't believe that this philosophy can be understood. So the thought of enlightenment should be presented with scientific knowledge. So I give the floor to Mr. Kemal. Could you please turn on your microphone?
Çok teşekkür ederim sevgili Songül. Kadın haklarının
Thank you, Songül.
bize söz vermiştik. Evet. Şimdi ben iki arkadaşıma çok teşekkür ederim. Hem
I would like to
Firdevs,
thank both colleagues, Firdevs and Haluk.
Tonguç'tan özellikle çok önemli şeyler söyledi. Tonguç'un bütün mektuplarına bakıyoruz. Hepsi
When we look at the letters of Tonguç, he addresses the receivers of the letters as dear son or dear daughter. So he also instills these great words to teachers or principals of village institutes. Village institutes are aiming for the integral development of students. Now I will read a letter in the same way. Haluk also talked about the universal nature of these things. He also refers to Vivaldi and Aşık Veysel. Distinguished participants, I will read the letter for you. I also see or consider village institutes as institutions that are developing some positive attitudes. Dear son, you will learn lots of things in the village institutes. You will also improve your arts. You will learn how to ride a bike or motorcycle, and you will learn how to play an instrument. So he says that you will acquire these skills. Let's look at an answer to this letter 5 years later. This is a letter by a principal of the village institute. I'm writing this letter to you. I go on well with my neighbors. I teach some games and plays to some students. I really like that a lot. I will be beneficial to other students. What does this letter mean? So the aim has been achieved out of village institutes. The students I graduate the students that they graduate are actually to still have communication with their principals. But currently, we don't have such relation in the faculties of education. As you can remember, there was a ad by Turkcell. A student is graduating, she becomes a teacher, goes to a school in the East, and this teacher cannot fire the stove in the classroom.
Şimdi sevgili arkadaşlar bir çok açık
Distinguished
özellikle sizin
colleagues,
eğitim fakültesi öğretim üyeleri mutlaka var.
there are some lecturers from the faculties of education and training. So please train your students to prepare them for school life and daily life. I'm from Muğla. I'm really honored to give an address in an organization held by Muğla University. Now I look at Kavaklıdere, and there are nearly 80 teachers. They come to Kavaklıdere from Muğla, and then they return to Muğla. So teachers have lost their motivation to stay in the places they work. I would like to give an anecdote from my father. Actually, my father came to the village with a horse, with a cow, and he was given a land in the village. So you need to train your students as some handicrafts other than some theoretical knowledge, because in the education system of village institutes, there were some courses on beekeeping and so on, and the teachers of village institutes also gave training on these subjects. So teachers of village institutes are also coming to villages with some occupational skills, and they try to instill these skills to them. They were institutions providing ski training, cooking training to the students. I have some photos, but I couldn't show them to you. They are also providing training on photography. There was no computer in village institutes in those years. So what was the aim of agricultural training? So they tried to give some modern techniques and train people with some modern techniques. And in the beginning of our program, we listened to the anthem of agriculture. We plant, and the money we earn comes to the pocket of villagers, and let's go to the front of agriculture for the development of the nation and country. This anthem shows a symbol of self-confidence. Süleyman Aydemir was a teacher in Gönen Village Institute. We actually practically taught everything to our students, and we provided training on beekeeping and agriculture. And we actually tried to respond to the needs of village institutes. So village institutes had some functions for transforming villages, but we don't have any concrete aim of the faculties of education currently. In that sense, village institutes embraced the happiness of teaching something. So their curricula were not fixed and they were adapted to the regions where they operate. So Beşikdüzü Village Institute, for example, gave some training on fishing because of the region. And all processes, all education processes in village institutes focused on the real problems of the region. My father was the principal of Gönen Village Institute. I clearly remember the day on which I started school. There were some skills instilled to you. For example, before class, we were running around the school. Each morning, 1,000 students were actually dancing and making music in the morning, and they started the day like that. It creates a motivation for students, and it is also very useful and beneficial to the physical and mental health of students. So they turned into cultural schools. Aşık Veysel, Ruhi Su, and Muzaffer Sarı Sözen are really important. In Aşık Veysel and Ruhi Su acted as trainers in village institutes because village institutes had difficulty in finding music teachers. So Muzaffer Sarı Sözen has a show on state radio, and it's a 1 hour show. So all people in village institutes were listening to the courses of Muzaffer Sarı Sözen, and the students who are knowledgeable or skillful at music were teaching those courses to their peers. Tonguç had an instruction stating that all kinds of instruments need to be kept and made available in village institutes, and all musical activities need to be encouraged in village institutes. These courses, I think, are very valuable. Were they totally open? Yes, they were open for 12 months. They went to their villages for 1 month on leave, but they brought back samples with regard to plants from their own villages. Even during the holiday, they had some homework to do. What was another achievement of village institutes? They were some hours for debate. Tonguç had a circular stating that students need to be instilled with the habit of reading books. What was the consequence of that? What was the achievement out of that? There were lots of authors and poets graduating from village institutes, and we have seen the realities of village institutes through these authors and poets. So one of the students has said that we are staying in the mosque and we are using it as a dormitory, and we are actually reading some books through the books scattered on the table for 20 years. On April 17, I have lots of poets, and all graduates from the village institutes provide us with the poets they wrote. what is another achievement out of village institutes? They are authentic and original institutions with no problem with regard to equal opportunities, and these are institutions with no discrimination of gender. In 1940s and 50s, there was mixed education only in village institutes. That's why mixed education was eliminated in Turkey because of the opposing views. There were free reading hours, there were visits to other cities. These were very important achievements out of village institutes. There was a constructive style. Could you please sum up within 5 minutes, because I'll give the floor to Hasan, Haluk, Erdem, because our interpreters will move to another meeting at 3:20 p.m. Village institutes were democratic education institutions. These institutions need to provide all students with theoretical and practical knowledge. How did this democratic education reflect itself or manifest itself on daily life? So the Federation of Turkish Teachers was established to introduce this training to daily life. In 1947, Hasan Superior Village Institute was established to train teachers for village institutes. It was unfortunately closed down after it trained 247 teachers. So in village institutes in 1943, 1,600 health personnel were trained. Now I will read two letters and conclude my remarks. The first letter is as follows. Dursun Akcan. He's from Ardahan, a village from Ardahan. He comes to Ardahan. He writes a letter to Hasan Ali Yücel, and İsmail Hakkı Tonguç writes a letter to Dursun. Thank you for your resistance. You will have your certificate, and after February 23, you will go to Cilavuz Village Institute. Thank you very much. Then this letter is really important for his life. There is another letter from the principal of Ortaklar Village Institute. Dear son, you are entitled to be a student of our village institute. Thank you very much for your achievements. We are looking forward to seeing you in our village institute. Make the following preparations. Please have a haircut, make your cleaning. The principal of Ortaklar Village Institute in 1946 and 47, village institutes were closed down. Sabahattin Ali was killed. In 1950, mixed education was abolished. In 1954, village institutes were closed down by the government party. All teachers of the 1968 generation were graduates of village institutes. On the other hand, we are looking for an original and authentic education system today, and those teachers are leading figures in that search. In the upcoming period, the aim of our teachers is to improve current schools and turn them into a paradise of education. In 2021, all education system, the entire education system has lost its nature. With these feelings, I would like to extend my deepest regards to you. I hope that a civic council will be reinvigorated as village institutes. Turkey needs an education reform immediately, and our aim is to train qualified teachers for the entire country. We achieved to do that in 1940, and we will also do that in the upcoming century. Thank you.
Kemal Hocam, teşekkür ediyorum.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kemal.
Seni orada çok beklettik.
Now, I would like to give the floor to Haluk again.
Söz senin.
Now the floor is yours.
Konuşmacı olmak ya da toparlayıcı olmak
Being the last speaker is really difficult, but you have assume an important role as the one who is summing up the session. 15 minutes later, our interpreters will move to another session, and we would like to thank our interpreters for their great efforts. Thank you, Mrs. Songül.
Ben Ankara Üniversitesi Eğitim Bilimleri Fakültesi
I'm
Eğitimin Felsefi, Sosyal ve Tarih Temelleri Anabilim Dalı öğretim üyesiyim.
working at the Department of Education at Ankara University. We are not discussing the philosophy of education. So we have a division of education philosophy. These philosophies are important. If we do not think about our education system, we always forget that there's an education philosophy at the heart of education systems. Developed education systems are not only limited to education. It seems to be a conflicting sentence, but it depends on philosophy, anthropology, and other sciences. Village institutes must be considered within the framework of those thoughts. So there are very important turning points for some theories. Today, we don't have any philosophy in our education system. You are trying to refer to village institutes established in 1940. So you are talking about management, they are talking about self-management, you are talking about skills, they are talking about self-skills, you are talking about criticism and they are talking about self-criticism, you are talking about confidence and they are talking about self-confidence. So the concepts are different and they manifest themselves differently in practical terms. Concepts are the architects and foundations of thinking. We can not only focus on a turning point of education history, and we cannot always refer to the history. The concepts will reinvigorate us and they will give us a concrete basis. So we need to go towards the way the philosophy is guiding us. There are some thoughts that are connected with village institutes, and John Dewey came to Turkey and he also asked this question in an examination, and one of the options was village institutes in these exams. We the experience of village institutes will be reinvigorated through the understanding of concepts. You can see them in the works of Hasan Ali Yücel and İsmail Hakkı Tonguç.
Okuduğumu varsayarak söyleyeceğim noktalar şunlar.
There are some points I would like to consider.
Hasan Ali Yücel
Hasan Ali Yücel
özgü, çok farklı bir
has created a very important concept of humanism that is specific for this country.
orada Yücel'in belki de
We need to focus on the concepts of Hasan Ali Yücel. He created innovation in humanism. So he's trying to ensure integration for education system. Aşık Veysel and Mozart are listened to in the same campus. So the classics of the West and East are combined in the same system. The history of humanism needs to be embraced again and again.
Yani bunu biz başaramadık açıkçası.
We couldn't succeed in that.
Bu anlamda çok
In that sense,
bunu yeniden düşünmeliyiz.
we have to reconsider this point.
Özellikle
There is another point we have to refer to. İsmail Hakkı Tonguç refers to the immigration or re-immigration of villages through a new system. There was a feudal structure in the villages back then, but the social structure plays a role here. However, we have to transform individuals one by one, because when you touch upon each individual, you turn them into a subject. There was a great poem about this issue. We were like grasses and bugs. Let's think about a person. This person is a different subject. This person has different characteristics when compared to other beings or creatures. We are doing something, we are creating civilizations, we are coping up with crises. But this ontological entity must be turned into a character or subject again. This was the problem and encountered in the medieval age, because there was no subject. But with the introduction of Renaissance, we had an enlightenment, and we were turned into subjects again. So it was created in works, in folkloric works, paintings, musical illustrations. And it was actually created in ideas. According to philosophy, if we have ideas, then that concept is immortal. If not, then we cannot talk about this issue. The idea of freedom will actually survive until ideas are permanent, as long as ideas are permanent. So village institutes were encompassing those ideas. And when we have such a perception of village institutes, we see that there are lots of differences when compared to our own system now. So those children woke up at 5 a.m. in the morning because there was a motivation. Today, we cannot encourage students to read something other than their textbooks. There was no textbook back then. They were trying to transform the nature, and they are trying to create a new environment. So this was an education movement. It was quite important. So you all were invigorating the village, and there was a theoretical knowledge behind them. All these things were covered in these works. There were two great thinkers who were including those thoughts and teachings in their books. So it was just like the modernity in Europe. Europe was indebted this indebted to modernity in terms of their achievements. All those values were embedded in modernity. So we have to think about these things. Maybe the foreign listeners or participants may think that we are focusing on a single idea, but these concepts are common heritage. I would like to sum up in that way. The village institutes and their concepts are really important. We have to reinvigorate those concepts. We have to redevelop those concepts, and we have to instill them into the society. Therefore, we don't need that. Maybe we are lagging behind in PISA tests, but we have to improve our system by relying upon the skills that were beautiful, applied, and that became successful in the past. So this capital aspect is manifesting itself in education. So we have to focus on these concepts, but this thought must be relied upon philosophical basis, and we have to rely upon an important cement, which is the village institutes. So we need lots of important concepts to have an universal value. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Haluk. I guess Mr. Kemal had to leave. Actually, there were one or two questions to him. Maybe we can convey these questions to him and he will answer those questions later on. There's a question to you, Mr. Haluk, in the chat part. Oğuz Coşkun is asking a question to you. He also directed these questions to me. What do you think about the identity of teachers today? When we look at the identity of teachers today, I think Mr. Haluk is the best person to address this question. Indeed, there's a very important thing he has addressed. He said that we couldn't encourage students to read anything other than their textbooks. The education system in Turkey must be debated by the faculties of education in Turkey. Actually, the quality of education must be questioned in detail. And we need a restructuring process for education. And currently, we don't focus on students or teachers. We don't have such a university life. Therefore, those people who have become teachers in that sense cannot actually instill these skills to their students. They just become teacher because they need to work. That's why they cannot be successful. Therefore, we cannot train people as intellectual. That's why we have to revisit this subject. So it requires an integrated approach. We are just applying a set of curricula based on the determinants of the process. So we cannot train any intellectual. That's the end of interpreting service. Thank you for listening.
Bugünü nasıl değerlendiriyorsunuz Sayın Hocam?
Bana 2 soru sorulmuş ama sonra soruyu soran Oğuz Bey'e teşekkür ederim. Son konuşmam, ek konuşmamda bu soruya cevap verdiğini söylüyor. Dolayısıyla o soruya bir daha dönüp cevaplamayı gerekli bulmuyorum. Ama öğretmen kimliği sorunuz için birkaç şey söylemek isterim. Bugün belki de ülkenin kaderi artık eğitime bağlı olduğu hep söylendi gerçek olarak. Yani geleceğimiz buna bağlı olduğu bir kader bu. Fakat bugün eğitim işte bu geleceğimizi de çiziyor. Eğitime çizdiğimiz her rötuş, geleceğimize çizdiğimiz bir rötuş oluyor. Çok iyimser miyim? Çok karamsar olmamakla beraber eğitimde geldiğimiz noktanın çok sorunları olduğunu düşünüyorum. Bu yalnızca tabii ki salgın dönemine özgü sorunlar değil. Salgın dönemi bunu biraz daha arttırdı. Özellikle salgın döneminin eğitimdeki eşitsizliği yeniden ortaya çıkaran bir turnusol kağıt olması çok dikkate değer. Yani hala ülkede 1-1,5 milyon öğrencinin belli nedenlerle internet erişiminin olmaması, yani eğitim yapamıyor demektir bu. Çünkü bugün eğitim artık çevrim içi gidiyor. Bir şekilde yapamaması çok ilginçtir. Ve hala ben yine de bir sorun olarak görüyorum. Okumaz yazmazlığımız noktasında çözümlendim gibi bir zanna kapıldık ama ben hala bu konuyu bile tam çözeceğimizi düşünmüyorum ki Mustafa Necati'den beri sonra da Hasan Ali Yücel'in o meşhur sözüyle bu ülkenin dağlarında ve bayırlarında kendi başına açık solan çiçek bırakmayacağız dediği bir cümleyle biz bugün hala çok hesaplaşamadık. Hala kendi başına açık solan, yaşadı mı, büyüdü mü, öldü mü, ne aldığı, nasıl bir eğitimden geçti, neyi değiştirdiğini bilmediğimiz, işte Mehmet Başaran'ın o şiirinde otlar ve böcekler gibiydik deyip o yalnızlaşmayı anlattığı bir gerçekle yaşıyoruz bu ülkenin gerçeğini. Yani 21. yüzyıl bu kadar büyük bir yalnızlaşmayı getirmemeliydi. İşte biz burada tekrar edelim. Köy enstitüleri aslında bir tür yeniden bir araya gelip canlanma ve dayanışma ruhunun da göstergesi olan yerlerdi. Çünkü insan olan bir şeye yabancı değil denen ürettiği her şeyi gerçekleştireceği bir olanak bulması çok önemliydi. Biz bugün bile rastlıyoruz. Ben eğitim fakültesi öğretim üyesiyim. Öğrencilerimde rastlıyorum, mezun ettiğim öğrencilerde. Hala içlerinde saklı kalan şeylerin ne olduğunun ortaya çıkartılmadığından söz ediyorlar. Yani eğitim aslında bizde bir çekirdek olarak bulunan potansiyelin ortaya çıkartılma sürecinin adı. Ama biz hala eğitimi istendik davranış kazandırma diye tanımlıyoruz 21. yüzyılda. O sırada insanın karmaşık yapısına artık nüfuz etmeli eğitim. Yalnızca davranış göstergesi olmamalı. Bunun bütün yaratıcı, bilişsel süreçlerine katarak, karmaşıklığını görerek, insan varlığının yani aslında iş dönüp dolaşıp nasıl bir insan varlığı tasarımımızın neyle ilişkilendireceğine geliyor. Yani ben hep tezlerde bunu da yazdırırım. Yani hangi düşünürün eğitim görüşü olursa olsun mutlaka onun insan anlayışını ortaya çıkar gel. Yani insan anlayışımızın ortaya çıkartılmadan üstüne konmuş bir eğitim çok temelsiz oluyor ve bugün yapılan bu. Biz bugün nasıl bir insan sorusuna çok cevap veremiyoruz. Yani felsefe antropolojisi olmayan bir uygulamadan devam edip gidiyoruz. Bu en büyük hataydı. Çok büyük bir raydan çıkıştır bu. İnsan antropolojisinden çıkmak demek, ekonomide insanı boğan, eğitimde insanı sarmalayan ve yarattığı politik manevralarla insanı kıstıran bir yön taşır. İnsan kendi potansiyeliyle barışıksa dünyada bir barış isteyebilir ancak ya da haklarını talep edebilir. Kendi potansiyelini ortaya çıkarmadığı bir dünyada yaşama birlikteliği, bir arada yaşamak kardeşliğini söylemek çok temelsiz geliyor. Bugün biraz daha kendi içimizde saklı olan şeyin ne olduğu merakını taşımalı eğitim. Bu eğitim bunu ortaya çıkarmaya yetmiyor. İşte o Simurg kuşudaki gibi aynaya baktığımızda, kendi yüzümüzü gördüğümüzde kendimize bakma cesareti gösterebildiğimiz bir eğitim ve bu cesareti söyleyebilmeyi getiren bir eğitim. İşte size parezeden söz etmiştim. Çok önemli bir kavram olarak dile getirdim. Sözünü olduğu gibi söyleyebilme cesareti. Göğüsleri bunları yaratmıştı. O işte bu cesaretle o yapıtlar çıktı, yaratıcı yazarlar ortaya çıktı. Bakınız siz sayılar verdiniz. 17 bin mezun ettiğini ve 1600 yaklaşık sağlık çalışanı mezun ettiğini söylediniz. İşlerinden çok ünlü sanatçılar, bilim adamları. Bakınız çok ilginç. Aziz Sancar'a Nobel ödülünün arkasındaki başarıyı soruyorsunuz. köy enstitülerini hatırlatıyor. Yaşar Kemal kendisine verilen ödül töreninde köy enstitüleri kapatılmasaydı çok Yaşar Kemal çıkardı diyor. Yani bunları her kanattan örneklerle beslemek olası. Yani o olanaksızlıklar içerisinde kuş olup gidip yem neredeyse yiyen bir yalnızlık içerisinde değiller. İçindeki yaşattıklarını, yarattıklarını sergileyen insanlar bu insanlar ve mutluydular. İşte bir Başgöz'ün bu kadar büyük bir halk kültürüne, halk bilimine, folklore katkı yapma gerçeğin arkasında bu zengin halk kültürü yatıyordu. İşte halk kültürü dokundu köy enstitülerinde. Yani o yüzden deyişler, deyimler, türküler bunlar bestelendi, bunlar sözlendi, bunlar notlandırıldı. Dolayısıyla bu zengin damarı yeniden yakalamalıyız. Çünkü bu zengin damar bu topraklarda vardı. Tonguç'un yaptığı şey bu damarı yakalamak ve bu damarı öğrencilerine göstermekti. Bu çocuklar gittiler, antik kentler gezdiler. Uygulamalı yolculuklara girdiler, yolculuk yaptılar, seyahat ettiler. Ülke topraklarını gezdiler, ülkesini tanıdılar. Biz hala Karadeniz bölgesinin özelliklerini kitaplardan bilip Karadeniz'e gitmeyen bir nesil yetiştiriyoruz. Hala kendi yaşadığı toprağındaki zengin uygarlıkları bilmeden ama tarih kitaplarında kronolojisi verilmiş, tarih ezbere verdiğimiz bir tarih bilgisinden geçiriyoruz. Biraz daha dokunmak gerekiyor. İşte dokunduğunuzda bu topraklar size çok şey söylüyor. Belki de bu öz kök çok önemli. Kökleşmenin de bir adı. Yani köksüzlük duygusu bugün gençlerde çok var. Kendini mesela belirsiz, bir şeye dayanmayan, değerleri olmayan bir varlık olarak algıladığını da bazen söylerler. Oysa bu ülkenin değerlerini yeniden düşünüp onların içinde büyümek, sarmalanmak, eğitimin bir parçası olmalıydı. Ama bugün eğitim buna bir yabancılaşma katıyor. Eğitim biz neredeyse kültüre yabancılaştıran bir çizgide. Ne bir kitap okuma, ne bir sinema, ne bir tiyatro, ne Anadolu'nun o zengin kültür mirasını ortaya koyma. Bakınız mavi yolcuları düşünelim. O balıkçılar, Sabahattin Eyüboğulları hep bu zengin topraklarla beslendiler. Bu topraklar büyük yaptı. Yani sadece onlara yazmak kalmıştı. Onların kitapları işte bu toprağı tanımanın adıydı. İşte toprağın tanımanın en önemli adı köy enstitüleridir. Toprağı tanıdığınızda kökünüzü bulursunuz. Kökünü bulan da binlerce yıldır sarmalar, kökleşir, uzar, dalları uzar ve size meyveler verir. Böyle görüyorum. Bunlar aynı zamanda ülkesini çok seven insanlardı. Çok zaman zaman üzüntü duyuyorum. Bazı ideolojik yaklaşmaların buralarda farklı insan tipleri yarattıklarını hala iddia ediyorlar. Bunlar her türlü değere saygılı insanlardı. Köy enstitüleri kurulduğu zaman ilk yaptıkları şey bir Türk bayrağı çekmekti. Bakınız onunla ilgili çok fotoğraf vardır benim elimde. Selam dururlar o yamalı pantolonlarıyla Türk bayrağını özenle yaptıkları bayrak direne diktiklerinde ve üzülüyorum. Onların milliyetçi olmadıklarından mı söz ederler? Bunlar siyasal ideolojinin aygıtlarını taşımaktan mı söz ederler? İşte faşist olmadıkları mı kalmıştı, komünist olmadıkları mı kalmıştı? Yani işin en de ilginç yanı hem faşistler hem komünistler. Yani bir insan bu kadar çok şey nasıl olabilir? Gerçekten bütün bunların arkasında bir bilgisizliğin olduğunu düşünüyorum. Bir kötü niyet olduğu düşüncesini taşımakla beraber ama önce bilgilenmenin yeniden nedir sorusuna tekrar dönelim ve orada bitireyim. Felsefenin en temel sorusu üzerinde tartıştığımız gerçeğin nedir, ne olduğu sorusunu sorarak başlayalım. Cevabını hemen hazır vermeyelim. İşte köy enstitüleri nedir? İşte bunu o yapıtlarda, uygulamalarda tanıyalım. Ben inanıyorum ki herkesin ortak noktası olacak. Herhangi bir ideolojik ayrım yapmıyorum bunu söylerken. Ya da bir partinin arka bahçesi halinde de getirmiyorum. Kaldı ki belli bir dönem sahiplendi gibi düşünülse de belli bir parti. Ben böyle bir partinin arka bahçesi olduğunu düşünüyorum. Bütün bunlar, hatta Tonguç, biliyorsunuz milletvekilliği teklifi yapılır. Tonguç'a gelirler, evinde ziyaret ederler. Hayır der. Ben bütün bunları bir parti içine sokmak için mi yapmaya çalışıyorum? Hayır der ve bütün bu dışarıdan sarmalanan cendereden uzak kalır. Özen gösterir. Kendi içindeki zenginliği korumak adına çaba gösterir. Anılar önünde saygıyla eğiliyorum. Geçen 2 gün önce Cebeci Asrı Mezarlığı'nda İsmail Hakkı Tonguç'u mezarını ziyaret ettik. Zaman zaman gideriz. Ve o mezarlıkta önemli çınarlar vardır. İşte Hasan Ali Yücel de vardır, Vasıf Çınar da vardır. Mustafa Necatilerin, Saffet Arıkanların anlaşılmadığı bir eğitim tarihi eksik kalır. Bunları anlamak gerekir diye düşünüyorum. Sonuçta bizim kendimize özgü bir modelimiz ve bu modeli de kendi literatürümden okumakta yarar var. Dışarıdan ikincil, üçüncül bakış açılarını da okuyorum ama onların kaynaklarına hiç referans vermezler. Yani düşünün, Köhensler'in yazan bir kitapta Yücel'in bir kitabı yok kaynakçada, Tonguç'un bir kitabı yok kaynakçada. Yani bazen şaşırıyorum, akademik liyakat ve nitelik gereği bu yapılmalı artık. Bu kadar haksızlığa gerek yok diyorum. Ama belli de bir yol kat edildiği bir düşüncesindeyim. Artık belli noktalarda anlaşıldı ve bir araya geliyoruz ki bu kongre bunun en güzel göstergesi. Her farklı yaklaşımdan katılımcılar var ama bizi buluşturan, bizi birleştirebilecek değerlerden yanayız. Çünkü bizi birleştiren değerlerin bizi ayıranlardan daha fazla olduğunu düşünen biriyim. Bunlardan biri de bu enstitü gerçeğidir diye düşünüyorum Songül Hocam.
Haluk Hocam çok teşekkür ediyorum. Evet, biz bugün 81. yıl dönümünü kutluyoruz köy enstitülerinin. Aslında böyle bir özel panelin olması bile bir gelecekte bizim için umut, bu ülke için bir umuttur diyorum. O yüzden köy enstitüsünün dayanışmacı ruhunu, toplumu dönüştürme ve örgütleme ruhunu yeniden canlandırması dileğiyle tüm katılımcılara çok teşekkür ediyorum. Başta Muğla Üniversitesi olmak üzere sevgili düzenleyici kuruluşta yer alan bütün sevgili arkadaşlarımıza, katılımcılarımıza 2,5 saat bizimle birlikte oldukları için çok çok teşekkür ediyorum. Gelecekte daha güzel günlerde köy enstitülerinin bütün modelini, bütün süreçlerini, tartışmalarını daha canlı ve yüz yüze ortamda sizlerle birlikte yapmayı diliyoruz sevgili arkadaşlar. Tüm panelist arkadaşlarım adına tekrar teşekkür ediyorum. Hepinize sevgiler, saygılar sunuyorum.
Teşekkürler.
Teşekkürler.